Thank you so much. Good morning to all of you. Thank you for such lovely words. Thank you, Rosenthal, for being so insistent. He's been insisting on this for years, but here I am. Here I want to have a conversation with you, fundamentally about how to be a journalist in difficult situations. How do you do it when you are in a country where censorship, the lack of connectivity, fear, and the limited experience of working in a free press and meet the international standards, how do you do that under those circumstances? And I'm going to dare by starting with a question. What is that you see on the screen? You, Rosenthal, you like technology. It's a pen drive. ¿Alguien más? Someone else? USB, flash drive. Some people call it the Mayan key. I think it's a beautiful way of talking about it. Really? This is much more than just a little piece of technology. This little thing, this little object that fits in your pocket, this is freedom. For many Cubans, this is the difference between having access to information or not, between being silent and having a word, between censorship and be able to be a journalist. Don't forget, we live in one of those countries that has less connectivity than any other country in the world. The only country that has less is North Korea. We are one of the we're the second country regarding these limitations. Only 5% of the Cuban population has access to this large international web. Only 1% is able to access internet through wide bandwidth. We are totally disconnected. We not only don't have access to the internet, we also have other serious problems. Those few Wi-Fi zones, which have just recently become available, which have made headlines throughout the world, they are so expensive. $2 an hour, which in Cuba is extremely expensive. It's very censored, and it has to be in a public place, which is not the ideal place to try and work as a professional or trying to do any journalism. But still, notwithstanding all the censorship, the high prices, the instability of connections, people have massively turned out to these public Wi-Fi access points, and for the first time, many of them have even been able to look at the web. This is a phenomenon that we have just seen in Cuba throughout the last 2 years. And this is really interesting because we were hoping that people would step up and we would turn out and, overthrow the government. But what we've done is turned out to connect to the internet. But at least it's a step. And this is in a world of journalism which is quite complex. For more than 50 years, we have lived in a world of total monopolistic control of the press by the party and by the unions. Every radio station, every TV station, everything, the newspapers are in hands of the government. There is no other source or ability to write journalism or get near a microphone on the radio or even appear on TV if you are not invited by the government or at least a member of the government. That has been our reality for over 50 years. So that kind of control, which managed to exclude all the news that the government didn't want out of the country, that control has now been broken. And it's been broken thanks to these small pieces of technology, the flash drives. That young teenager in 1989, whose name was Yoani Sanchez, when the Berlin Wall came down, it took me 5 years to be able to see those images, to see the people of Berlin with their hammers breaking down that wall that had split Germany in two. Today in Cuba, practically speaking, it only takes a few hours for Cubans to find out what's happening in the world. And that is not thanks to the government. That does not mean that the government has become more flexible, is more tolerant, more inclusive. That's not what it means. This is fundamentally due to this technology. This is the Grama newspaper today. And this is what is published today. They're exactly the same, right? Today is the first day of the Communist Party's 7th Congress. And these are the front pages of the official press. What do you think? Isn't this interesting? Look at all the variety. That's what we have lived with throughout all these years. And it seemed that the government was going to be always able to prevent us from finding out what's happening in history, which officially were erased from our history, but also what was going on just a few feet from our house or from our lives. We are a country where we have had to learn how to detect everything that is censored and prohibited and discovered. We are part of the black market. You buy your milk, you buy your beef, and you buy your medications through the black market. And that's what we've done with information also. It is exactly the same black market technique that starts with a rumor, then is converting information. What we call Radio Bemba, the spoken news, and it has really created the most incredible networks of transmitting information through external hard drives, through CDs, through the USBs, through the floppy. We use everything to share the information. And this has been our liberation. And this has been the infrastructure that has allowed us to break the monopoly the government has had as to access to information. And through this infrastructure, Cubans started to get on the web, and they found something out that they no longer needed to hear the government speech, to be able to give their opinion. You had blogs, you had WordPress, Twitter, and little by little, Cubans started talking about their lives, their complaints, the reports of police harassment, just a little like to questionable information on Facebook. Little by little, we became virtual citizens in a country where we even haven't been able to gain full citizenship. The internet is the public square where we can all talk. It doesn't exist anywhere, but it exists everywhere. And that's where my project was born. 14 and a half. It's an independent digital newspaper. Isn't it a contradiction? We have such little access, and here we have a digital newspaper. But we would have never been authorized to do this and be able to sell it on the street corner. So we learned. We didn't decide to do this. This wasn't our choice to be virtual. Let's be native to the digital world. That was our only option. And that's how 14 and a half was born. May 21st, 2014. I worked for 7 years in my blog on Generation Y, but it's been an incredible blog. It's an incredible experience, but it's very personal. It's kind of a catharsis for me. I write about daily life, but I felt I wanted more. Cubans need information. So with the intention of providing that information, giving them the facts, to talk about reality, that was the goal with which 14 and a half was born. And it's about to turn 2 years old. Why 14 and a half? We were born in one of these Yugoslavian-style housing units in 2014. And we were capturing the Y of my blog in the logo because I was talking about Generation and medio, which means half as well as the media. So that's a little bit of the history of why we named it 14 and a half. In that public housing building of Havana, we decided to be, one, economically independent. And how were we going to do that? In a country where most people that work for the government. And the government is never going to finance a newspaper that doesn't follow the official line, that isn't part of the Communist Party, and that dares to criticize. So that is our reality for the last 2 years. Number one, we decided not to accept not government funds, not party funds, we want to be able to complain about Fidel Castro and about everything we want to complain. So that independence has allowed us to explore new routes. How do we make a living? How? Well, this is the same as what's going on throughout the world. We have events, we advertise. I think in the next few months we will also launch a friendly subscriber. So we need you all to subscribe. And that has allowed us to explore a new path for Cuba, that we have journalism that is free of all the ties of the funds that have been available in that country. It has been hard, but we've managed to do it. Another goal was to find those small openings within the legal framework that prohibits free prints to try and acquire some kind of legal position. In Cuba, there are more than 500,000 employees that now work for the private sector, but they're not called that. Those who work in the private sector, those are called independent workers. To the unemployed, those are called the available workers. To the private sector, it's independent contractors. So what we've discovered is when you work as an independent person, which only allows there to be, 200 different professions. You can be an attorney, but you can't be an architect. You can be a tailor if you work on your own, but you can't be a lawyer. And you cannot be a journalist on your own, but you can be a typist. So we decided that our team, we would work as typists, and that's what we are. We are typists. We type our own ideas. Another goal, which we have tried to achieve throughout these 2 years, is to offer a variety of information, something that has always been a part of independent press in the U.S. If the government says yes, the independents say no. If one says white, the other one says black. Green, red. The past, we look at the future. There's always been this contradictory fight, and we want to do away with that. And we want to provide information, whether it's positive, negative, be it about culture, be it about politics, be it about daily life. And so there at 14 and a half, we have a lot of cultural information. It is a daily that talks about economics, about sports, about what's going on in the exile. Also has a lot of information about government. And there's parts that people really like this one. In a country where it's so hard to buy food, where the government will not admit that a pound of beans costs 1 day's salary. In that kind of country, people do not have access to the information about no public information about what food costs. So what have we done? We have this market section, and once a week, we look at 6 different markets throughout the entire island and giving them the most current prices. And what have we found out? We have our own Dow Jones. The price of pork, with boneless pork, pork is the product everyone wants to buy. And that is what is that thin line between those who are truly poor and those who have a little bit of more money. And so, by generating this simple list, we have been able to show that today in Havana, a worker has to work 2 days to be able to pay for boneless pork, for a pound of boneless pork. That is facts. That is information. You can draw your own conclusions. And that is so typical of 14 and a half. Who inspired me to this? My mom. My mom worked for so many years as a taxi driver. And when I talk to my mom, and I talk about democracy, human rights, freedom, she listens to me. And 3 minutes later, yeah, okay, my head hurts.
But when I tell my mother why she has to pay for 2 days' wages for a pound of boneless pork, she says, this country has to change. This tool, this pricing tool, is conceived with people like my mother in mind, a majority of Cubans. We've lived very intense days recently. March was terrible. Barack Obama came to Cuba, and the Rolling Stones came with just a week's difference. This was really our test of fire in terms of covering news. The enemy finally came to Havana, and then the satanic majesties of the Rolling Stones also played in the capital of Cuba. This has been very important for our small team of writers. And I will take the advantage of saying that you shouldn't hide. We have a group of us here. A number of us are here. Raise your hands. A number of members from 14 and a half, as well as from Convivencia, a magazine that is done in Pinar del Rio, the westernmost province, where everything is a lot harder even than in Havana. Between Barack Obama and the Rolling Stones, these two events really put our offline press room to the test. We have a digital newspaper, and we ourselves are not connected. So how do we do this? Through very creative methods. Our creativity is to be able to open a window when the door is closed. It's that ability that all Cubans have to develop early on to be able to survive in a country where everything is lacking, especially access. So this creativity has made us use tools that are so simple, such as email. Most of the news stream from 14 Medio goes out through email. And this also requires certain efforts. We have to wake up generally at 3:30 in the morning to use a slow connection. I read the Granma newspaper before Raúl Castro does at 3:30 in the morning. And this allows us to have an editorial line based on what the official press is also saying that day. All of this, with Obama's arrival and with the migration crisis of so many Cubans crossing the straits to Central America and to Florida, have required us to be ever more dynamic, more focused on our reality, and with a lot more participation by our audience. A large part of our content, of our portal's content, is sent to us from within Cuba and without. For example, This report here has a video that was filmed by some balseros, some rafters who were crossing the Straits of Florida and began filming. Cubans have begun to realize that the government is not going to tell their reality. They have to narrate their own story. And this has changed mentality. And it has been an important mind shift that has benefited 14 y Medio. For people who are not connected, we have a PDF version that we publish every Friday, which has the highlights of our week, and it is sent through flash memory. That's how it's shared. Through alternative, illegal networks, by hand. It's not possible for the government to put a policeman on every corner to find out who's carrying a flash memory or a memory flash drive in his or her pocket. This has allowed us to share our information. We also, through SMS, do headlines, email, just text messages, and very slowly we have built an audience. But we want a greater audience. This is the year in which 14 and a half, 14 y Medio, wants to make the leap to visual means, to audiovisual means. We have a small studio, and we want to be able to reach Cubans with audiovisual material through this means, this media that reaches so many people, which is combining visuals with voice. That's our challenge for this year. Another challenge for us is to do data journalism. This is a wholly unexplored area in journalism in Cuba. Journalism over the last 50 years has been shaped and characterized by mostly ideology, very little research on the most important issues, and above all, a secrecy and lack of transparency of all official institutions. To go knock on somebody's door, a government agency's door, and finding out the salary of a minister is impossible. And that's why our goal, our important goal, is to develop the basis that we would need for a journalism school that would treat this with seriousness and professional rigor. Another dream of ours is to have our own app. Imagine in a country with 11 million in population and 3 million telephone lines, with 11 million people and only 3 million telephone lines. This is perhaps the most important channel. We want to reach Cubans, the youngest Cubans, who could share our content, so that one person can go to a Wi-Fi zone and can unload the daily edition, could then share it and repeat it, and copy it. That's the most extreme form of viral sharing. We also want to grow our email subscription. If you don't have internet, we want you to be able to read it just in text form. This doesn't mean that we are going to settle or say we don't want to open a portal. We want Cuba to have internet. We want our users to be able to read us on our page or on Facebook. But until that day arrives, we need to be creative. What's the goal of all of this? Why do journalism in such difficult circumstances? Why should we insist on putting together a paper when everything suggests that it would be better in Cuba to be a tourist guide or to do something else, something that would bring us more money, something that would that would be better paid and be less dangerous. But those who will vote and decide on the future of Cuba are our concern. When I'm asked who the next president of Cuba is going to be, I always say, I'm not concerned about that. I'm more concerned with who the future citizens of Cuba will be, and those citizens need information. If they have no information with which to choose, they will continue to choose poorly, badly. They will choose the most populist discourse, the one whose siren song is the most charismatic voice they hear. If they have information of their own, they will be able to choose. 14 Medio wants to be the media of the transition in Cuba. We want to go hand in hand with the citizens of Cuba with this throughout this process. We want to share information for it to be useful. We're not only going to reach them through the pages of our newspapers, we're also going to do so with whatever technology we have available to us. And that technology today is a flash drive. That's why, in the future, when Cuba is a free and democratic country, we'll have to build a monument to the flash drive in a plaza in Cuba. Thank you very much. But I have a small correction, because if you're going to build a monument, I think the flash has to be in your hand. No, I don't want to be on any statue, please. Well, there's a great deal of humility in you. Thank you, and congratulations to the whole team of 14 Medio. It's been very interesting to get to know you. You've said a number of times that your son inspires you very much. How old is he? Teo's 21. And my question is, how does he get his news? Well, Teo is part of a generation for which technology is just practically an extension of his body. So I always ask him what movies he's watching, what information he and his schoolmates are consuming. And it's very interesting because it's not very different from what is read or what is sought for by young people anywhere in the world. I'm happy to know that despite the governmental restrictions and the censorship, young people in Cuba feel themselves to be cosmopolitan and world citizens like any Austin or Berlin young person. Now then, the information that they're looking for is generally practical information or playful. Many people say that they're apathetic. I prefer that they be apathetic than that they be fanatical, because you can wake up from apathy. I was myself an apathetic young person. And so between that apathy and technology, I think my son's generation, Theo's generation, will be a generation that will wake up. I'm here with a number of entrepreneurial journalists, and there are two Venezuelans, one's from Cucuyo and the other one from Diario Besazo. So what advice do you have for my friends who are also trying to publish information in a country where there are so many press restrictions? I don't want to give them any advice. I want to apologize to them. I am sorry to Venezuela for what we have done to them. Everything suggests that the current situation in Venezuela will continue for some time, and that it is possible that there will be even greater censorship. So my recommendation to them would be to not leave out any possibility, any technological means of communicating, even if it seems minor. I would recommend applications or Twitter, SMS publications, which is how I do this in Cuba. Many people say, how do you tweet? Well, I tweet by SMS and email. I do it blindly. I can't answer tweets. I can't read what other people tweet, but I have been able to broadcast with images on SMS. Someday, I have to come to Austin and give a class on tweeting in difficult situations. I, above all, would say that you need to maintain a discourse for diversity. Firm and closed-mindedness is always easily detectable in social networks. We're not looking to unify a single voice and asking for the same thing. Rosenthal, I think we need to have MOOCs on a flash drive to be able to send them to Cuba. I have a number of more questions, but I imagine there are many people in our audience also who have questions. And if they would like to come to a microphone, and you're welcome to ask questions in English, we'll translate as well. And if you'll just line up. So, you've written a lot about the fact that many Cubans admire President Obama. I understand you can criticize him like others can, but I understand that President Obama's visit to Cuba attracted so much attention. Why do you think his visit was important, and what are your expectations for Cuban-U.S. relations? Obama's visit obviously touched the hearts of Cubans. And this was possible, or this happened, because of diplomatic and political reasons, but also for symbolic reasons. When on a television screen in our country, Cubans saw the arrival of Obama and his family on the plane, it was raining in Obama. Obama came out, and he held his own umbrella, and he covered himself and his wife. Cuban officials who were waiting there, Raúl Castro did not go to the airport to greet him. The Cuban officials had behind them other functionaries of the government who were holding the umbrellas. That very small detail had a great repercussion. Also, you need to remember that we live in an island with a lot of mestizo and black Cubans in our population, but it's been years since that group in our Cuban population has been able to get close to power and sit anywhere near the presidency. So Obama sends a very strong message to that population that is very discriminated, that does not have the possibility of participating in choosing our destiny. And this young president in a country that's governed by 80-year-olds, this president that runs down the airplane steps, that's a very strong message. He has a family. During decades, Cubans didn't know whether Cuba's President Fidel Castro was married or not, whether he had children or not. That's symbolic. Now, politically, his gestures while he was in Cuba, to be able to speak to young people, to speak about the future, to try to turn the page on the past, that was very bothersome for the official regime. To meet entrepreneurs, to talk about internet. When somebody talks to Cubans about the need to connect to the internet and to take steps to help them, that's music to their ears. What do I think the future holds for us? Well, we have difficult times ahead of us. Cuba's official regime has a attraction and repulsion with the White House. This process has started, it's underway, but they know that it is a dangerous road for the official discourse, because the official discourse is based on the existence of the enemy. You have to have Goliath, because otherwise David makes no sense. I think there are going to be lots of obstacles along the road. The government has given way on Obama's part, but Raúl Castro has practically not budged. All right, I see there are other people waiting. There's a Cuban line for me at the microphone, I can see. Thank you, Yoani, for your question. It was said yesterday that in authoritarian countries, there's not a lot difference between activism and journalism. I'd like to know your opinion about that. In the case of Cuba, what has happened is that the government, particularly Fidel Castro's government, undid civil society. I like to think of civil society as a fabric that has thicker and thinner threads in it. But from the very beginning, from 1959, Raúl Castro made it his task to outlaw parties, to cut those threads of the social fabric, to prohibit associations. And this brought as a result that when Cubans could begin to express ourselves through technology, all those voices that were now silenced, people who had legal problems, people who had been put in jail for economic crimes that can only make sense in countries where everything is prohibited, who argued that their human rights had been violated. When the small window of technology was open, everybody wanted to use that. Of course, that's normal. In an authoritarian and totalitarian country, journalism plays other roles, and journalists must play other roles. The roles of lawyers, of activists, of human rights defenders, of advocates. But for my own peace of mind as well as yours, these roles begin to be differentiated again, as should be the case. A broadening of technological access, the greater international visibility for the LGBT movements and other movements, independent lawyers, this begins to allow these groups to express themselves and for journalism to play its own role, reporting on facts, on what is happening, and simply being a loudspeaker for everyone's voices and not just for one sector. Another question. Please, I'd like to congratulate you first off for your effort. It was amazing to see after Obama went to Cuba, he arrived in Buenos Aires, and in Buenos Aires there were protests against Obama, when you might have imagined that there would have been protests in Cuba against Obama. And I was thinking about this and what you commented on about Cuba's youth. That would be my first observation. Secondly, you mentioned Venezuela. I lived in Venezuela for a number of years, and I'm surprised to see that the Cuban exile does not appear to nearly have any effect on Cuba. And in Venezuela, there's been an effort to create newspapers in exile in Miami, where there's been a coexistence for 60 years between Cuban exiles and Cuba. Why do you think that is? And finally, since I have the microphone, how can we, journalists such as myself, collaborate and help? I'll answer that question first, the last one. The doors are open for you. We have a very flexible editorial line in terms of issues that we cover. We're interested in international as well as national news. We have certain restrictions, no violence. We'll never take verbal violence as a editorial line, but we respect all opinions and the complete spectrum of opinions. We like to publish interviews and reports, so we'll welcome those kinds of contributions, but if they're actually news reports, so much the better. As to your question about why there weren't protests against Obama in Havana, for the same reason that there's never been a protest against the U.S. jail in Guantanamo, even though Guantanamo is part of our island, is on our island. Why? Because you can't protest in Cuba if the government doesn't call for that protest. If the government doesn't promote that protest and invite people to protest or push people to protest, the fear of reprisals, the fear of the problems has paralyzed Cuba's citizenry. It's very sad because a Cuban today prefers to risk his life by crossing the jungles of Central America, by crossing the straits of Florida, full of sharks, than to face up to the political police or the national security apparatus of our country. In terms of the exile community, I would say that Venezuela's exiles have had a much greater visibility thanks to technology and public social networks. Also, the Cuban exiles have maintained their legal status within Venezuela. In Cuba, those who left were nearly, they lost their legal rights. They couldn't vote, even in those sham elections that we have in our country. So this meant a different form of exile. And Cubans have been exiled for more than 50 years. So these are a number of generations that have been born out away from our country. So I think that would be the main difference. Well, we could talk all day with you, but Rosenthal tells me we're almost out of time. I understand others have asked you, why don't you lead a revolution in Cuba? I think the journalists here could be interested in knowing what your answer is. I would prefer for the future in my country to not depend on another revolution. Please, God, no more revolutions. I don't want another leader coming down from the mountain. I don't want another charismatic leader in front of a microphone. No military in uniforms involved. I'm leading a technological and news revolution, a journalistic revolution. I think that's my role. I am not a politician. Thank you. Thank you to you.